Welcome to VidDevo Church and to Utah VidDevo SONRISE. They say let the sun rise with healing in his wings, but this morning it looks a little dark and rainy. They tell me we need the rain, kind of like your body needs the water. Otherwise, a drought in your soul or a drought in your spirit, much less your body dehydrated, is not a good thing. Neither is it good for the land to be parched without moisture. For plant life to grow, for mankind to live, we all need a huge amount of water. Take heed unto thyself. Every man that strives for the mastery is temperate in all things. Now they do it to obtain a corruptible crown, but we an incorruptible one. I therefore so run, not as uncertainly, so fight I, not as one that beats the air, but I keep under my body and bring it unto or into subjection, lest by any means when I have preached to others, I myself should be a castaway. Now what do they mean by that? Well, to begin with, it talks about every man that strives for the mastery is temperate in all things. Some people are passionate, some people are impassioned, some people get upset easily, some people are provocable or non-provocable. Our temperament is our personality traits that kind of indicate what type of person we are, but not really. Because you see, we can allow ourselves to be controlled by our flesh, or we could deny ourselves by taking up our cross and following Jesus and having our bodily appetites as well as our sinful flesh lessened of control over us, and God placed on the throne of our heart in control of our lives. In other words, if you're yielding yourself to doing the will of God, then God's will is that He should direct your path. We're told in Proverbs 3, 5, and 6 to trust in the Lord with all our heart, to lean not into our own understanding, but in all our ways acknowledge Him, and He can direct our path. One of the ways He does that is by teaching us what Jesus said. If you'll read the words in red, you'll see that everything Paul said after what Jesus said, and everything that is prophesied looking to Jesus from the Old Testament or from the law, all of it is focused as like a fulcrum to the very center point of Jesus Himself. When you want to know a fact, you look at Jesus. When you want to know an application of that fact, you look at the law and the prophets, or look at the law that churches teach, which is usually from Paul or Peter or somewhere in the New Testament, or they'll reach back and grab something out of the Old Testament and use that. But really, Jesus said there's an easier way, a more excellent way, and that's to follow what Jesus had to say. So, when you're striving for mastery, as what Paul says here in 1 Timothy 4:16, when he's writing to a Gentile believer, a young man who's entered into the ministry, a person who is less than confident in himself, then what he's talking about is kind of like, you get a lot of wild ideas when you're a young man. You get a lot of kind of unusual kind of, directions you want to go when you're a young pastor or a minister or a teacher. Until you have some elderly advice, some sagely wisdom from someone who's been living for a while, you might want to go the wrong direction, kind of like when Moses was trying to take too much work on his own hands. His grandfather or his father-in-law simply said, look, you're going to die listening to, 1 million people, 6 million people, however many millions of Jews there were, trying to settle all these cases. We need to set forth some principles, some laws, some societal, governmental involvement of people being responsible for themselves. And in America, we call that civil law and constitutional law. We don't all stand before a judge every day to try to figure out, well, what should we have done? Rather, we have guidelines that the law is meant to tell us what to do. And then because we won't do it, we have jurisprudence, which means simply the idea that for every action, if you break the law, you have a consequence, a reaction. Kind of like physics in sociology. But we don't really apply what we're talking about here unless we take it to our own lives, personally. In other words, you shouldn't need a law to tell you what to do. You should know inside of you what God has told you to do, and then don't do it. Your conscience be your guide used to be something that was taught, but people had seared their conscience because of either television or friendships, social pressure, or ideals or ideologies that they have come up with in society for a freedom to have everything going on all at the same time, kind of like Israel was under Solomon. I mean, under Solomon, here they were, blessed out of their mind. They had more money and they know what to do with. They even had to tell people, we don't need any more money. We'll bless you. And Solomon allowed for his wives to build little temples all throughout Israel that would worship other gods. And so people could pick and choose what they wanted to do. So really, they had no moral compass. They had no internal security of knowing what God's will is, much like today. Today, you could call situational ethics or relational mores or relational style legalities, kind of like, when people are saying and arguing about the definition of marriage. The definition of marriage has nothing to do with, the gay community getting married. I mean, legally, LGBT community has a right to be married because it's a civil right. It's just, two people living together. They get the freedom of living together, and then they're responsible to each other. And then society has to pay for it one way or another. So it's covered by civil law in the Constitution. Civilians that are joining together in union in a cohabitation is called civil marriage. That's what the legal definition is. Christians arguing about some ridiculous idea of what marriage is don't know what they're talking about. They're trying to argue religious law and then religious idealism in a court of law. I think Jesus had something to say about that. So for ourselves, we're supposed to have a moral compass inside that determines the direction we go. It would be to say like, well, I don't know what to do, so where do I turn to? Well, do you turn to the Bible or do you turn to God and ask Him to show you in the Bible? You see, there's a big difference there. One is religious, the other is relational. Anyone can preach. And as he said, if I don't put myself under subjection of my flesh, meaning that I put down those earthly desires, the want for vengeance, the desire for, lusting after the flesh, meaning the pride of life or the lust of the eye, then in some ways, after I've told everyone what not to do, then I wind up doing that, then I'm condemned. Oh, God will use my preaching, and God may use my teaching, but He may cast me away. I mean, one of the things that I've tried to tell people is that when Bob Coy fell from his ministerial position as being in charge of a church, that didn't mean his teaching was wrong. They should have left it up. It just meant that after having preached, he be a castaway was simply because he may not have risen to the level of his own quality of teaching that he could have learned from himself. Much like I always say, hey, just because I say it doesn't mean I live it. It means that I'm learning it. And that's the point of what all of us are doing as the Spirit of God is giving us inspiration. So Paul warns us to be careful, because even the things that we say, the things we teach, the things we preach, the things we want to do aren't always the things we are doing. Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. It's interesting that each one of those really isn't defined. I mean, because people don't want to know who the battle really belongs to and where and what we wrestle against. When it says we wrestle not against flesh and blood, people want a victim. They want a scapegoat. Somebody like President Obama or somebody like whoever you're voting against in order to vote for. In other words, a lot of society today and a lot of people and humanity isn't for something. They're against something, so they talk about the bad news rather than the good news. Well, I got news for you. I got great news. I'm for something. I'm for the victim in every story is me, but the progenitor of what's causing that victimization of me is me. In other words, I'm responsible for my own problems and I'm responsible for my own solutions. God has given me his spirit. I can resist the devil and he will flee, or I can insist on the devil and he will take control of my life. The resistance and the insistence is mine. The determination of whether I win or lose is up to my choice of who I yield myself to. If I yield myself to sin, I'm a sinner. If I yield myself to killing in the name of God, I'm a killer. No matter how you look at the military, murder is murder. Killing is killing. You can't call it anything else. If I'm a butcher, I butcher animals. If I'm a baker, I bake cakes. If I'm a fruit grower, I grow fruit. I mean, it's pretty simple, really. What you say and what it is pretty simple by the words. So when we look at the words, it says that we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities. It's very interesting that it's principalities. You know, all cities in America are called principalities. That's an interesting word because it means the principal of those entities that are inside of the principal area that's designated and separated from other areas. In other words, the commonwealth of people assembling together isn't church, which is what church means, assembling together of people, but the principality is the area of involvement that the boundaries have been designated for those that contained within that principal area of designation are considered the principality of Los Angeles, the principality of New York, the principality of, and it's a governance issue. Who's governing the principality? That's what God is saying. Because the principality, in a vague way, is influenced, as Mike McIntosh once gave a wonderful teaching back in the 70s, and I think it was 80s, about principalities, powers, spiritual wickedness, high places. A spiritual battle that if you want to change your city, you have to pray against the principality or the spiritual power that's behind what's going on in your city. Pray for your city. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. But not Jerusalem, the city, the principality that's controlling it, tearing it apart, pulling each side to, influence human beings who are easily influenced one way or another. So principality is meant to be a spiritual battle, not one with guns and not one with laws, but one with prayer and supplication, praying as Daniel did, and then having, as the angel told Daniel, I was resisted by the king of Macedonia, or wherever it was that he was going through, and the angel said, he hindered me. That's what principality is. And when we look at against powers, we have the power company, that's one way of looking at electric company, and they have control over you in some ways, don't they? Really? Come on, let's be honest. They do. Powers is meant to be like the Powers Act. The president has certain powers. The police officers have certain powers. The health department has certain powers. There are lots of people that fear Homeland Security because they have certain powers. There are different people that are conspiracists, or they have the spirit of fear, so to speak, or they have been influenced by fear so much that they can't look at anything without being afraid of it, of different powers that are out there. Even doctors have, and health officials have certain powers. Well, we wrestle not against the human being, but we wrestle against that power that they may have over us. And that's part of the problem of submission to authority. If we are yielding to the correct power, we would get vaccinated. But instead, fear has a power over us. So we yield ourselves to not wanting to be vaccinated because we think, oh my God, that's causing this, that, or the other thing, because somebody lied and put some lie on the internet, and then everyone jumped on the bandwagon to sell their own book, their own way of thinking, their own philosophy, their own unproven facts about vaccinations. And they claimed it caused everything from cancer to, I don't know, not PTSD, but vaccination. Well, actually, they actually claim PTSD, some of them. They even claim that, somehow getting vaccinated before you go overseas in the military causes it. So, the things people believe in. But the power of it, the power of influence is what we're talking about. What's influencing you is a power. It's a outside influence that's trying to convert something inside that you should have a peace about. A peace that passes all understanding, that no matter what happens, you don't react to it. It'd be foolish that you would have to react to everything that goes on in the powers that be outside of your influence or are able to change. You can't change the government, no matter how you vote. You can pray for the government, and God can change the king's heart and turn it in which way he chooses. You can pray, and you can accomplish more in one prayer than you can in 1,000 years of voting. So, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, there are rulers of the darkness of this world. What causes darkness? Well, the rulers of this world means that there are areas of involvement that are satanic. I mean, just bottom line. There used to be, like, everybody knew if you went down to Louisiana or you went down to the Deep South, that there was this Christophosis, or this cult of combining Catholicism with voodoo, with witchcraft, with paganism, and they would supposedly have this power that they were able to do to influence people with, sticking pins in them and doing all kinds of unusual things that now we make movies about, and we dabble in things we should not be involved in. There's a lot of misconception about the spiritual reality of the dimension that we live in. There are more than 3 dimensions. There's 4 and 5 and 6 and 7, and even Chuck Missler, in his studies, when you look at the 24 hours of the Bible, talks about how even the Jewish sages came up with how many dimensions there were, all from studying just Genesis. So there's more dimensions than you know about. And one of those dimensions is a spiritual dimension, and people get overloaded by thinking that mediums or Ouija boards or some tarot cards or somehow you're going to communicate with the dead. I mean, there's even churches that baptize for the dead. Now, how weird is that? Let the dead be baptized by themselves. It's just kind of bizarro when you start doing that. But the point of the matter being simply this, that the spiritual wickedness or spiritual darkness of this world is caused by the spiritual rulers of this world, and that the way the scriptures teach is the rulers of the darkness of this world and against spiritual wickedness in high places. Those two are actually demonic activity of some type. It doesn't have to be, like some major Satan does it or the devil made me do it kind of thing, because really you choose to do and follow whom you choose to do and follow. Demonic activity can be something where you decide to indulge in. I know for myself, until I saw The Exorcist, I never would have thought of anything demonic, but frankly, The Exorcist kind of freaked me out. Not because I believed in The Exorcist or that anything like that could ever happen. It doesn't. I mean, demonic possession does, but it doesn't go away that way, and it doesn't happen that way. But there are things that are greater than I am, that I can't control, that even Jesus said you can't do this except for prayer and fasting and God's will. So there are things in the world that you don't know about, that you shouldn't be involved in unless God leads you in and teaches you how to deal with those things. Because God leading you might say, don't go there. And that's how you yield yourself to not being influenced against spiritual wickedness in high places and the rulers of the darkness of this world. If it's dark, go somewhere else where it's light. We're children of the light and children of the day. We need not stumble, but we can walk away from those things and then trust in the Lord to do His will in accomplishing His purposes in that darkness. You don't have to go there. You don't go to darkness to become like darkness. You go to the light to become like the light. They that are Christ have crucified the flesh. They that are walking with Jesus have, what? Taken up their cross and followed Him. That's what Paul's saying. They that are Christ have crucified the flesh. You're carrying your cross so that you can nail your hide to the wall, literally. with the affections and lusts. When you follow Jesus, you have to deny some of your ungodly mentality. If that's pornography and it's leading you to, commit, like spilling your seed on the ground, which is masturbation, or if it's causing you to lust after a woman and you need release, and you say, oh, well, I couldn't stand the pressure, then don't get involved in the pornography in the first place. That's the point it's making. You indulge your flesh, and your flesh overwhelms you. Your spirit warned you beginning that you didn't need to go there in the first place. And if you don't, then you will not fulfill the lust of the flesh. We're told, flee youthful lust. Well, the same thing's true about lust of the eye. You can't get tempted if your eyes are not looking at that which tempts you, and then you will not indulge in it. Myself, I have to avoid certain things. I just go, hey, you know what? I'm on the internet all the time. If I even look, it's like, oh, man, then my mind is filled with just garbage. And garbage in, garbage out. It'll cause you to sin. Guaranteed. Oh, sure, if we confess our sins, he's faithful and just to forgive us our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. But they that are of Jesus and with Jesus have crucified the flesh. That means you murder the flesh, like the whosoevers like to say. From reckoning the old man dead, which is you, the whosoevers teach to murder your flesh. Now, if you wanted to commit murder, that's the way to do it. Kill yourself. I mean, your bodily appetites, your fleshy desires, your lust of the eye, lust of the flesh, and pride of life. If we live in the Spirit, let us also walk in the Spirit. I like the way that it's added there after, murdering the flesh, because it's if. Jesus used if a lot. Paul used some of it. John used some of it. But it always makes you the responsible party for choosing what you will do. You have the choice. It's your, quote unquote, like Americans always like to argue about and say, I got freedom to do what I want. Well, you think you do, and you think you've defined freedom, but really, you can't stop doing what you're doing. That's not free. That's, in fact, in bondage and in sin. Most of the times, Christians don't know how to explain to non-Christians what they're talking about. They use spiritual terms, and simply what it means, you're an addict. You're addicted to this type of environment that you have to do it. You have to eat. You have to sleep. You have to take in nourishment. You have to drink water, like we talked about. This plant has to have sunlight, soil, warmth, and it responds. If you wanted to call it an addict, it is. It is totally addicted to sunlight, totally addicted to soil, totally addicted to water, totally addicted to nutrients. I mean, that's one way of saying it, but the reality is that that's what God intended for it. So, on the one hand, you could say it's addicted because it's mandatory for it to have, but you could also say it's a blessing of having that need to be met in the soil, in the water, in the nutrients, in the sunlight, in the way God cares for it. God meets our needs. He doesn't meet our addictions. So, if we live in the Spirit, let us also walk in the Spirit, for as we know, the Spirit of God, we're told, would lead us to knowing Jesus. He would guide us to understanding His Word. He would provide for us all things pertaining to godliness. If you read about the Spirit of God consistently, then you'll hear that everything that we talk about God being and God doing and God accomplishing in our life always is pointed back to this Spirit of God. It's amazing because most people will not think about being led by the Spirit. They think it's some kind of like, kind of like this goosebumpily, you got to have kind of like this chills up and down your spine. You got to pray in tongues, speak in tongues, and do all kinds of weird things you've seen on TV. When in reality, that's not what it's talking about. Being led by the Spirit is simply meaning that internally, you are different than your external. I mean, I look in the mirror and I go, ew, that's not me. Or I look on the outside and I say, this is nice what I live in, this flesh, this body that I have, and I'm thankful for it. But it's got some real issues. But I know that there's more to me than just simply my body. I mean, my body, if I take it to the doctors, I can stick it with a pin, and there's a certain amount of autonomous response that if I stick a pin into this nerve center, that nerve is going to say, ouch, Actually, it's not. It's going to send an electric impulse to my brain, and then my brain's going to say, ouch. Now, if they put something to block that autonomous nerve ending response between my brain cells up there in my brain, which is a chemical, and if they put something to block between the nodes that are just simply 2 points, just like if you had an electric charge, you could put one little pinhead here and one little pinhead here, and electricity jumps back and forth, and you could see it like a little, you could say a zap of lightning, but you could see the electrical charge go back and forth. It's kind of neat, in science. The same thing happens in your brain, only on a micro level. It's happening so fast, constantly, that you actually, if you look at the aura, if you take pictures and photographs, you know what an aura is. Your body has this electrical kind of like emanation that's called an aura, and it's because of all the electrical charges of your nerves that are actually an electrical wiring system inside you that conducts electricity. Now, it's kind of a biochemical electricity, but it's still a nerve ending, and if you got stuck with a pin, it would send a signal to your brain, and your brain would identify it and make you feel something from it. The nerves can only identify certain things. Puncturing is one of them. Pressure, cold, heat, are other ones that different nerves respond in different ways. So say you get stuck with a pin, but if there's a blockage there of some reason, if you had nerve damage, then you wouldn't feel it. Or if you induce something with drugs, like say pain pills or something, or some other way, a beta blocker, which is simply a chemical that can stop that electrical pulse from going from one node to the other node inside your brain, then that would stop it from happening. Now, that's just simply the body. If the body is that complicated, go ahead, try to explain to me the soul and why I can have emotion. And I know that that doesn't explain feelings when it comes to my emotions. So I know there's more to life than just simply the body and its physical reactions to stimuli. I know that I can induce stimuli. I can feel things that are not from external stimuli, but are internally induced. To be led by the Spirit means that there's a third part of that component that we all are. We're told by God that in creation He made them body, soul, and spirit. And that technically in the Garden of Eden, when Adam died, he died spiritually. So people that are born usually of the flesh. I mean, I can't think of any other way to be born except that which is born of the flesh is flesh, and that which is born of the spirit is spirit. And Jesus said, of course you're born of flesh. You're born of the blood and the water, and you kind of go, yeah, you could see that in a bloody mess when you're born. Pretty simple there, you burst the water, and there's a bloody mess when you come out. That's procreation. But what makes that soul, or what makes that life, is when God breathes life into it at some point in time when there was that gestation of the sperm and the ovum. When God breathes life into it, that becomes a living soul. So it has a responsive capability, a emotive base. And beyond that is what Jesus said is true. After you're alive, so to speak, having a soul and a body, somewhere along the line you go, what's Jesus talking about when he says there's a spiritual birth? Then you realize there's more to life than just soul and body. I mean, don't get me wrong. If you got soul music, and you got soul, I mean, you're kind of cool, you feel like it. But you feel like there's something more at some point in time in life, and you realize it's a spiritual necessity to discover and uncover the reality of something missing in your life. Most people go on a spiritual journey for all of their life and maybe miss the boat. I don't know. I think deep down inside, Romans is true. In the book of Romans, Paul wrote about every man knows God at some point in time. Well, I don't know, but I'm pretty sure that's true, because I frankly have met people that say they don't believe in God, and then I kind of listen to them for a while, and yeah, they do. They just reject what he had to tell them to do, or whatever reason they may have to reject him. They at one time knew God. And as Romans says, they changed the image of the incorruptible God into the image of corruptible man. And so God gives them over to their own desires and their own lusts, and they change their idea about God into some kind of thing they can reject. Well, for me, that's okay. If that's what your God is, I can understand how you did it, because you kind of rejected what God said and made up your own so you could reject him. Me personally, I have a real issue about trying to reject somebody that created me. I don't really think I'm smart enough to, or wise enough, or big enough to get away with it. But if there's the idea of the blatant, what do they call that? There's a little mouse cartoon that they used to show that this little mouse was about to be grabbed by this eagle, with claws, and he's, like the object of rebellion because he's flipping off with his middle finger, the eagle or something, and it's like the ultimate stupidity, but the ultimate reality of how even obstinacy can be something that, at the last, even in the face of facts, you reject the truth. And that's what God said would happen. Even as Pharaoh rejected the fact that God kept giving him a chance to, let his people go. And finally Pharaoh said no, and God said, fine, I'm going to make you live your own thing. And he hardened his heart. Each one of us could do that. We could reject being knowledgeable about the fact that we all are tripartite beings, just like God is tripartite, or three parts to his being, the Godhead, being that it's Father, Son, and Spirit, and that the same thing is true in creation. When we look at creation, there are three parts to everything that's created, whether you know it or not, or you understand it, or you apply it, or you learn it. That's up to you and God and science and technology and everything else. But you can figure it out. I mean, God said it's revealed in nature. So you could do that like C.S. Lewis did, if you're smart enough, or if you ask God to show you. But being that we don't know that, we need that spiritual life, so we have to become born again of the Spirit. Or as the Hebrew says, not just, the Hebrew words are kind of fun. When you look at Hebrew, in the biblical Hebrew, they used certain words to mean more than one meaning, because it applied to more than one part of life. Like looking at a plant, I could say that's a plant, but that doesn't define everything that a plant is. That plant has a leaf, it has a stem, it has a flower, it has sometimes, if it's a vining fruit plant, it would be, fruit. But a plant isn't just simply a plant. There's more to it than just saying plant, obviously. Well, Hebrew tried to incorporate that in their way of writing words that covered meaning that was beyond simply a single word. An example would be like my name. My name is Michael, but in Hebrew that means who is likened unto God. And I happen to like that because I am always asking that. Yeah, who is like unto God? And frankly, that's kind of the way my life has been. Questioning and learning and applying, but always having a question and questioning things. And God honored that and gave me answers. I like that. And so Hebrew, in its way of dealing with communication, would often use singular words to describe multiple meanings. And so I forgot what word I was going to use now that I used the word Michael, because it was like such a blowing me away when I first learned that one that I always get sidetracked on that one. But the point of it being is that there's more to the meaning and the interpretation of it than what we understand. Often, like, I remember the word we were going to use, when Jesus was saying, you must be born again, and then explained it to Nicodemus, who was a teacher in Israel at the time, who was supposed to be a sage, he said, look, you know that it's that which is born of flesh. He said, well, yeah, obviously. But he says, that which is born of the Spirit is that which has come down from the Spirit of God. In other words, God said that you could be born of the heavenly. In other words, that which is born from above. And so sometimes in some of those Bible translations you look at, it'll say, you must be born from above. And that's just as true as saying born again. Now, the reason why it's saying born from above is because God is always observed in his spiritual kingdom as being above us, so to speak, because he is in greater magnificence, greater intellect, intelligence, all the omnis that you've heard of, omnipresent, whatever, omniscient, all that stuff meaning bigger. So bigger usually meant upward, and so they say born from above, but that could easily be stepping out of one dimension into another, dimensional realities. The quantum physics teaches about the dimensional realities of everything that exists around you, and you could never see it or never know it except that you step out of this dimension or you expand from one dimension to another. The greater you become, the more dimensions you occupy. So God could be right here, right now, as Jesus said, the kingdom of heaven is about you and within you at the same time. That's explained in quantum physics. Now, it's interesting that science could come up with that, and religion is still struggling. They just have to simply sometimes accept what God says, and then later figure out God will reveal it sooner or later to someone. Now, when we say born of the Spirit, that means born from above, that means born from God. In other words, while you look at mankind having, a man has seed of himself, so to speak, it's his sperm, so to speak, and then a woman doesn't have seed, she has ovum. So when you take the seed from a man and the ovum, or the egg, as it were, it's a cell, and put them together, they both have half of what is normally considered a physical being. The soulful part is when God breathes life into it. So you have tripartite participation there going on. And that becomes a living soul. But the missing part is that with which God has said that you must be born from above. So you must receive from God that spiritual birth. You can't get it from a man. You can't get it from a woman. You get it complete from the Spirit of God. You must be, as Jesus said, born of the Spirit. He must cause you to be born of the Spirit of God. Oftentimes people talk about the baptism of the Holy Spirit and get into weird stuff and weird ideas and, kinds of things that scare people. But technically it's the same thing in some ways. If you wanted to talk about how baptism is like being dunked, and cleaning the outside, well, a baptism of the Spirit is like cleaning the inside. Well, the same thing is true about born. If you're born of the outside physically, then being born of the Spirit spiritually is on the inside being born. Something is gestating, something is impregnating, and something is growing and multiplying within you, becoming stronger every day as you are led by the Spirit of God. So you see, the part of you that's growing inside is knowing God and growing in the knowledge of Him. The more you know Jesus, the more you know God, His Father, is what Jesus defined as, this is eternal life, that they should know me and know Him who sent me. He said, it's better if I don't stay here on the earth and explain all this stuff to you, because when I go to my Father, I will pray and He will send the Holy Spirit to you. He will be another comforter, someone else who will conform you, someone else who will speak to you, someone else who will teach you. As we're told, you have no need that any man teach you, but the Spirit of God who dwells within you, He will teach you all things. And so that other part of God, that reality of God, that being God in us, not just God with us, because when Jesus was with us, He was here. He was with us, obviously. He was a physical being. He was the physical representation of God. But to have Jesus in us spiritually, because God is one, and the Father and the Son are one, and the Spirit and God and Father and Son are one, even as He prayed for His disciples that they would be one. That unity we don't really understand completely, but we understand it in some ways, physically, emotionally, spiritually. So, in order for Jesus to be in us, or for the promise of Deuteronomy that said, I will be their people and I will be in them and I will be in the midst of them, means that God should be able to walk in the midst of them, but He also should be able to be inside them, which you would call possession. Well, you are God's prized possession, so He dispossesses you of the spirit that you are, which is of the God of this world, to be of the Spirit that He is, because God is a Spirit. So if God comes in you, you become born again. It's a long-winded, long story of something a child could very easily say, hey, is that kind of like when people, give you, this is the way I always explain to a little child gets it right like that. Instantaneously, they accept this just as an immediate response because they've seen TV. So I say, well, when you're breathing life into a body that's drowned, when you're holding the nose, and you breathe into their mouth, and you're breathing in them to get their lungs going. That's what God does when you're born again. Oh, so God spiritually that you can't see breathes into you and you become a living soul. You become born again. I said, yeah, that's what it is. It's, I tried to think of the word. What do we call that? Gosh, it's so perfect for born again too. Got to think about it for a minute. So I can say that in this teaching. The giving them not cardiopulmonary resuscitation, but because cardiopulmonary means to get the heart moving, but to mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. Mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. That really, because with the mouth profession is made unto eternal life, and to become born again, you have to ask and receive. Then it's mouth-to-mouth, so to speak, resuscitation, or spirit-to-spirit resuscitation. God is bringing life, spiritual life to you, being born again. God, without you seeing, believe it or not, the Spirit of God comes within you. The old epime in the Greek kind of playing thing. But really, if you could probably see it, I'll bet you that you look at it, you'll see that the Spirit of God goes, inside you, through your mouth, inside somehow into your spirit and your soul, and gets resided in your heart, as both people say. The heart was just simply the meaning that all life is there, because without your heart you can't live. So, guess what? 3 parts in their heart, which are 3 valves, technically, that are bringing in the good and pumping out the bad, kind of flushing the system regularly, continually going until one day that if it stops, you're dead, physically. But really, it's the epitome of what God is, 3 parts. So in that way, yes, God comes inside your heart, or the center of your being, and begins to grow, as we know, that as we read today, this morning, that if we live in the Spirit, let us also walk in the Spirit. For as many as are led by the Spirit of God, they are the sons of God. You can't be a son of God except by the Spirit of adoption, whereby we cry, Abba, Father, and God says, I have adopted you, I have accepted you, I am welcoming you as my child. And so as He grows us up by being led by the Spirit, He teaches us spiritual truth, spiritual reality, spiritual things that apply to every living part of creation. Now, I'll admit, it doesn't have a lot to do with mammon, because you can't serve God and mammon, and a lot of things that man has made is going to be wiped out in the Great Tribulation. That's kind of what God uses the Great Tribulation for in some ways. One of the benefits is He wipes out everything man made. That's what mammon is, man-made, and in the kingdom, got news for you. Maybe it's cleaning up the world so we can restore it to a garden. Not that I'm a greenie, but hey, I'm no weenie either, because I know that if you look at what we have done, it's not so glorious compared to what God has done. And the whole world is under a curse, so imagine what it must have been really like, what God intended, as opposed to what we pretend the world is today. We claim it's beautiful, but I got news for you. Compared to the heavenlies, it's living in a garbage can. So, meditate upon these things and give yourself wholly to them, that your profiting may appear to all. As you learn to yield to, or if you replay this VidDevo, you'll see that there's a whole bunch of heavenly, helpful material there, but it's also deep, because deep calls to deep, and I don't want you to be shallow. It's easy to be shallow and simply say, well, just be born again, and then you go, what? What's that mean? And then somebody gives you some kind of sinner's prayer and tells you to go there, and, you think you're there, and you find out, you sin, and you don't know what to do about that, and then they get you on and on and on, and in and in and in, and sooner or later you're dealing with all these issues you didn't know you had. Well, that's because it's really kind of deep waters when you talk about salvation. The gospel of salvation is simple, but it's complicated too, because the more you learn, the more you realize how much God has done for you and with you and wants to do to you. He's not going to leave you the way you are. Frankly, stinking is not a very good place to be. And when we look at ourselves, we have some pretty stinking thinking when we look in the mirror and we think that we're somehow wonderful. The mirror we're supposed to look in is called the Word of God. And it says we're a mirror, and we look in it and we see what Jesus is like, loving His enemies and dying for the world. And then He says, you be like me. And we go, I think I'll go look in the mirror, because I can't be like Jesus, but I can be like what I see in the mirror, like everybody else. And God doesn't want us to be like everybody else. God wants us to be led by the Spirit of God, because they are the sons of God. That's how you know you're a son of God. People want this assurance that, well, hey, I said a prayer, so I must be there. No, if you're led by the Spirit, then you are a son of God. Are you led by the Spirit? Then you know, you know. And if you don't know, you don't know. So if you don't know, then I suggest you get to know whether or not you know you are led by the Spirit of God. Because as many as are led by the Spirit of God, they are the sons of God. Now, how do you know? You know. How do you don't know? Easy, because you doubt. And, somebody who doubts or fears or worries, they're just like, any boat that's out on the ocean is tossed to and fro with every whim and doctrine, and they'll run from one church to another church to another church to another church, or they'll find somebody that'll tickle their ears and tell them something they want to hear so that they feel good about their salvation. If you want assurance of salvation, ask God. If you don't get an answer, keep asking. When you get an answer, then you know. If you don't know, then you don't know. But when you do know, you know. It's not something you're going to like, because you're going to rebel against that mentality and that thought process. But it is a reality. There's no assurance of salvation simply because you can put down a formula and say, I did it. That doesn't work that way. God works with personal relationships. He deals with you one-to-one. Even as we were talking about that mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. You might need a mouth-to-mouth resuscitation spiritually in order to get the reality of what God is saying about being led by the Spirit of God. Because except that God tell you an assurance, you have no assurance of salvation. The only thing you are assured of is condemnation. God did not send His Son into the world to condemn the world, but that through His Son, He might save the world technically from itself. So, really, the biggest battle you'll ever find is in yourself, about salvation and what you should do in relationship to who God is, what God is, and how God is dealing with you and you alone.